Hello everyone, I'm Claudia Lash, and for the past, maybe 2 months, maybe 3 months, I have been focusing on a fairly beginner quilt that is on my website right now. The quilt is called Twirlz, and in the first 2 videos, or first 3 videos, I don't know. First video, we made these blocks. These are the twirl blocks. And the next video, we talked about making this zigzag block here. And then we did, the third video, I think, was sewing the Twirlz blocks to the zigzag blocks for the inner quilt. So, this is the inner quilt. And the next part of the process is the borders. And for this quilt, I did the borders pretty much like I often do quilt borders. So I first did, and I'm going to use this pointer because I still have a broken arm and I'm one-handed right now. The first thing that I added, you're going to think about having this whole part done, down to here. So the first part that you have to add is this top border and this bottom border that's inside. If you look at the top border, you can see that these are flying geese, basically, flying geese blocks. And these blocks are made just like you make the flying geese blocks that are in each of the twirls. Here's one, here they are, and here's one there. But as you can see, these are bigger. So follow the directions in the pattern. You can get the pattern right now at a reduced price through the end of August. But just follow the directions. It's going to tell you how many squares you need to cut, how many flying geese that you need to make. And I believe on this you make 16 of these flying geese blocks. But you're only going to need 14. Because there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 at the top and 7 at the bottom. So there's 2 that you can use in something else or make whatever you like with those. After you get your flying geese blocks made, and they're done the way that you do when you have you make 4 geese together. And I've even got another video on my website, or on my YouTube, that shows about how to do 4 at a time flying geese. They're fairly common. So after you get those made, then you're going to sew them together. They're sewing them together to make a long section of flying geese. And maybe I should say, before we start, you do need to make sure when you finish this center part that you measure it and make sure, I don't know, this must have been, let's see. When I finished my inner quilt, it was 42.5 inches square. So I think each one of these finishes at 6 inches. It's 6.5 when you're working with it. So you're going to sew each of these together to make a long strip of flying geese blocks. And then you're going to do another set to go on the bottom. Once you have that long strip together, you're not going to sew it on the quilt yet. Instead, if you look at this quilt, there is a 1-inch little tiny black strip right above the geese. So, and the directions are in the pattern, but basically you're going to cut 2 strips and each one should be 1.5 inches by the length of your this strip. So that if this is 42.5, this guy going across there, then this top strip should be 42.5 by 1.5. So you sew the black strip and this strip together, and then you repeat for the bottom. Then you can sew these two things, you can sew them to the top of your inner quilt. And it's easier than it's not that difficult. It's when you look at the whole quilt, you think, oh my, where are the lines? But you can see it in the pattern. After you have these two inner top and bottom borders sewn on, then you're going to do the side borders. And if you look, here's a side border right here. It's a black strip with a pieced rectangle strip. Then, and the directions are in the pattern. You just need to cut, I think these rectangles must be like you cut them at 2.5 by 1.5, and then this is background fabric. So you can use any fabric. I think I did mine all the same, but basically a black and white works. So, and you're going to sew them together into 2 long strips, because you're just doing the side right now. Sew those together, and then sew this black inner strip. Maybe I can come over here and show you. You're going to sew this black inner strip to this strip. So these are inner side borders. When you have them sewn together, you're going to sew this long strip, you're going to sew this to this whole inner quilt right there. So that you'll go down to here and up to there and sew that on. Do the same on the other side. And then again, you may need to measure to see what this, and when I measure, I brought this measuring tape out. I usually either have it up on my wall here, and see how very talented I am with one hand. But I usually take a measuring tape and go like from here, go all the way down, and I measure, if I'm trying to find out how long, I might measure it through the center, might measure it on either side too, and come up with something that usually they're fairly close. So I always measure before I move on to the next section, because your quilt measurements may be slightly off of what is in a pattern. So you measure, use a measuring tape, and then when you have these two, this section on this side, you do the same on the other side. And then it's time to do the top. Now let me see here, yes. The top and the bottom borders. Well, the top inner border and the top border is inner and outer at the same time. So here's, again, you're going to sew these rectangles together, the length that's called for, and then this border is, I think, probably 3.5 inches when you cut it, so it ends up at 3 inches. But this border is sewn to this. Here, there's a seam here. So you're going to sew this to that, and the same thing on the bottom, and then sew this to the top of the quilt. Sew this to the bottom of the quilt. So the last thing that you have to do is just add 2 side borders, and they are the length of the quilt from top to bottom. I do it that way because all along you are measuring and you're finding out which is the, what's the size that you need for your quilt. And make sure it all hangs nicely. One more thing, when you're doing outside borders, all of the outside borders in my quilts, I always cut my fabric from the lengthwise grain of the fabric. Even if I have to piece some sections together, if you cut your border fabric from crosswise section of the fabric, then you're going to maybe have some waviness. You can sometimes see this when you see quilts hanging. If you see a quilt hanging and it has waves down here, or maybe even waves across the bottom, then probably that border was not cut from lengthwise. So for me, I want the quilt, when it's hanging or when it's laying wherever, I want it to look nice and straight. So if you can, cut your border pieces from the lengthwise grain of the fabric. And then final thing on the quilt, of course, is I thought a black and white binding would sort of set it off on this quilt. The quilting on this quilt was done, I think, by Cheryl Stewart. Let me see. Yes, Cheryl Stewart. So she did a really nice, and I said, I just want something simple. I don't want, but I do like the way that she did these big curly little stitches, and I think they just really make it much nicer. So the pattern is still on sale, and the directions are in the pattern how to do this. You can also, for this pattern, you could do lots of variations. I wanted to do something that had simple Twirlz blocks. You could do lots of different 6-inch blocks in here. You could, well, as I said before in another video, you could just take these out and put a panel or something in the middle and use these zigzags sort of along the side. There's just a lot of, I think, a lot of possibilities with this simple quilt pattern. So enjoy, I think, Twirlz. This is my last video on it. And if you have any other questions, you can just send me an email and I'll try to help you out. Meanwhile, have fun with your Twirlz quilt.